This is the judge wrote, we see an important government interest in controlling the availability of firearms for those who have ever been adjudicated mentally defective or had been committed to a mental institution but are now deemed to be cured.
Anyone under a judge's order to seek help as an outpatient, whether it's anger management for 6 to 8 weeks, 50 AA meetings, they could lose their firearms.
Right.
Today we're going to be talking about another kind of unique submachine gun called the KP-44.
Thanks for tuning in to Fired Up. I'm your host for the show, Bob Irwin, coming to you from the gun store in Las Vegas, Nevada. As listeners know, this program is all about guns and self-defense and politics related to guns. The panel discussion on this show, we're going to talk first from what I like to call my I couldn't possibly make this up file. Pennsylvania officer that is apparently too crazy to carry firearms off duty, but he's okay to carry firearms on duty. It's kind of complicated. In a related story, the White House announced just a few days before we filmed this some upcoming rules to clarify which mental health treatments must be reported to the citizens who can't carry guns list. And there's a lot of stuff in here that is of great interest if you forget where the show is and you want to replay it. This is show number 39. You can look it up when you see them on the web. This is one you want to look at if you own a gun. And we're going to talk about Illinois and the city of Chicago now being forced by the federal courts to allow citizens to defend themselves. And because they're now going to be required to let people buy guns, we may expect to see a drop in their murder rate, actually, in the next 6 months to a year. But we're going to start first talking about this police officer who's kind of caught in a web of government rules. We've always had the gun possession rule that once you're a felon, you're always a felon. In almost every case, when you become a prohibited person for whatever reason, it's permanent. And there's no gaining back your firearms rights, even if the conviction took place 100 years ago. Once you're on the list, you're on the list.
This guy is a classic example of how this happens. He went through a really dark time in his life. He's a police officer. He wound up getting involuntarily committed for treatment for severe depression. The report says that he's possibly suicidal. So after a period of time in a medical facility, he comes out, they declare him cured of his problem. He's learned to deal with these issues. He applies for and after a period of time, gets his job back. But, federally, as a person who's been involuntarily committed, he can't possess firearms. But the department trusts him enough while he's with other officers and he's a good guy, they'll let him carry a gun while on duty.
But not off duty.
But not off duty. He can't possess one off duty legally.
If he's great, if he's okay now, that's wonderful. That's obviously very important. We want him to be mentally healthy and all that. But how is he able to carry a gun even on duty based upon the fact that he has been involuntarily, treated for his mental issues at the time? How are you able to separate that between his work life and his personal life? I don't understand how
the
the
judge
two.
wrote, this is what the judge wrote, we see an important government interest in controlling the availability of firearms for those who have ever been adjudicated mentally defective or had been committed to a mental institution but are now deemed to be cured.
Yeah, but
Right. Okay.
But in all fairness, if he has been deemed cured, then who is the federal government to say, you know what? No. You can't have that firearm. I mean, even a criminal makes a conscious decision to be a criminal, to commit a criminal act, and so they are prohibited because they showed in their mind that they wanted to do this. Right? Here's a guy that went through a dark time. And quite honestly, I have an issue with the fact that he got his job back. Once if you are actually involuntarily committed and treated for a year, that raises the suspicion bar way up here as far as your mental competence. And so I have an issue with that. But that being said, if the doctors say, hey, this guy's okay now, you got to treat him fairly.
And it's a legal issue. That's clearly what we're dealing with here. Isn't a, gee, he's a nice guy. I'm sure he's a nice guy. He's a good cop. They say he's a good cop. We'll believe he's a good cop. This is a legal issue of, does the law treat everybody equally and fairly? You know, for example, here in Nevada, if you are convicted of a DUI, you can possess firearms, but you can't have a CCW for a 5-year period because we don't give CCWs to people with alcohol problems. This guy, he's appealing. He's in the courts. He just got turned down by another judge for full firearms rights. And I would be surprised if this doesn't wind up winding its way all the way up, because we're talking about look, if it's a medical condition that we can treat and cure a person of, then it's no longer a debilitating issue. And he should get his firearms rights back.
You know, maybe the jury, when this hits a jury, they could bend the law and create an exemption for cured people. Felons argue all the time that they did their 10 years that they were sentenced to, they paid their debt to society, so they should have their gun rights back. Well, this guy didn't even commit a crime. Yeah. He had a disease, in effect, and shouldn't he get his gun rights back?
Well, actually, the reality is that a felon can petition the court to have his gun rights restored to them, and they often do that.
I don't know about the word often. They have been known to do it. People have gotten their rights back more often than not, and I've done a few of these for clients where I want to get my gun rights back. We can get their civil rights restored, but almost always firearms are not included. To get your firearms rights back in a state case, you need a pardon from the governor or a specific order giving them back. In a federal case, you need a pardon from the president or a specific order giving you back those rights. The problem with the mental health is there's not really, yeah, we'll have a jury who will decide whether or not the law applies to this guy, and that'll be a technical issue of whether he was adjudicated or whether he was ever really mentally incompetent. It won't be an issue on whether the law says he can't ever have a firearm. Very few of these people who have this problem, and back in the dark days, and dark days being the 60s and 70s and early 80s, quite often people who had other issues were adjudicated mentally incompetent incorrectly and placed in facilities just because we didn't know how to treat them. We didn't know what to do with them. And some of those folks have taken their cases up, and the one case I'm familiar with, they actually got the original treating psychiatrist to come into court with an affidavit and say, I basically lied. He didn't have a problem. The family thought he needed to go into this facility and he didn't want to go, and I went along with it because that's what we all did back then. And now, 20 years later, I don't think he was ever mentally incompetent, so we should wipe the record clean. And
did he go to jail over that?
Never mind.
Whoa.
Malpractice maybe, but what he did wasn't a crime because in his medical opinion, it was the right thing to do at the time. Basically what he said was, medicine has moved forward. We understand these issues better now than we did back then. So the way we treated it then isn't necessarily indicative of the problems we're trying to keep guns away from. And that actually worked out well in that particular instance, but most of the time it's a failing argument.
Is there anything to be said for the fact that he was, and I don't mean to downplay this or trivialize this at all, but that he was just a danger to himself at the time? He was never outspoken or violent or aggressive towards anyone else. It was all internal with his struggle. Is there anything to be said for his case and how he might have gotten his job back?
Not under the law.
Not under the law. It's just, it's like either you hurt yourself or your neighbor, doesn't matter.
Yeah, if you're adjudicated mentally incompetent, which means a judge or other authority says you are, you are.
Doesn't matter what you do.
Right.
It's just that category.
If you're involuntarily committed and typically most states say that has to be more than like an overnight observation, right? Because sometimes somebody will be drunk, the cops will take him in and say, we don't think we need to arrest him, but we need to watch him, and they'll put him under a psych hold for a day. He'll sober up and he'll be like, gee, I'm a stockbroker and my Lamborghini's parked around from the bar, and they're like, okay, have a good day. That probably doesn't get there in most jurisdictions. But if you're in a facility for a year, being treated for severe depression involuntarily, which means I would like to leave, but those guys over there with the locks and the keys won't let me out, then that's a debilitating, legally debilitating issue. And it's a problem with the law is what it is, because we wrote this law at a time where the theory was it'll impact very few people, right? We didn't have, when the law was written, we didn't have the understanding of depression and other disorders that we now call mental diseases. And so it encompasses far more people than I think the original framers of this law ever intended.
And can you imagine what the liability issues? I mean, if you, being the defense attorney that you are, if this officer actually got involved in a officer-involved shooting that was questionable, this would open up a huge can of worms.
And I'm not going to weigh in on whether he should have got his job back or not, whether he was cured or not. I just don't understand the department saying
risk like
you
that.
can carry a gun on duty, but you can't carry a gun off duty. I can see them saying, hey, the administrative board said you get your job back. That's your desk, and this is your paperwork, and don't bring a gun to work.
They did say exactly that. The Commonwealth Court said he would get his back pay, $16,000, and be placed back on duty. That'll play very well into this next story we're going to talk about. This is the prelim to the axe really falling. We'll be back in just a bit. Don't go away.
Anyone under a judge's order to seek help as an outpatient, whether it's anger management for 6 to 8 weeks, 50 AA meetings, they could lose their firearms.
Right.
We are back here on Fired Up. After the story about Officer Keyes, I don't think we used his name, but in the last episode we talked about his problems. It's time we took a look at some new federal rules. Very recently, a week ago from when we're filming this, the White House proposed 2 new executive orders to make it easier for states to provide mental health information into our national background check system for firearms.
Well, what this proposal did, you know, the HIPAA laws are the privacy laws that safeguard the giving out of our private medical information to people that are not authorized to have it. So this executive order kind of changed that to make it easier for the states to give that information, and thereby undercut the HIPAA laws. Now, and this is done by executive order once again by the president.
The second proposal would clarify that those who are involuntarily committed to a mental institution, both inpatient and outpatient, and that would count under the order as committed to a mental institution. So both inpatient and outpatient, you've been committed to a mental institution. The change is to clarify for states whose records, what records to provide to the background check system as to whom is barred from having guns.
So anyone under a judge's order to seek help as an outpatient, whether it's anger management for 6 to 8 weeks, 50 AA meetings, they could lose their firearms
Right.
rights because it's considered
Inpatient and
not
outpatient.
voluntary. So their own healthcare provider prescribing serious mental drugs, you know, to help with your mental situation, like is that enough? Like where does this?
It's going to depend. It's a very complicated legal issue because it's going to hinge on the terminology. Before, we always argued over the word adjudicated. That's what our law says, and that's what most laws say. You had to be adjudicated, which means a judge had to say you can't. Very few people were ever actually adjudicated mentally incompetent. Now it's involuntarily committed, inpatient, outpatient. You're absolutely right. What if a judge says, I want you to seek mental health counseling because I think you've got a problem? I don't have a problem, Judge. I think you have a problem. Go see this counselor. The court will pay for it, and if they want to treat you, you must do it. You've now been involuntarily ordered into outpatient medical care for mental health issues, and that could be an issue. If this It's unknown if this political push is by the president or the vice president, and whether it could change anything at all. I haven't been able to find an actual executive order that's been posted yet. I think this was a trial balloon floated out of Vice President Biden's office to see what would happen. And actually, there's been some people on both sides of the fence that say, I don't really see anything wrong with that, but they're not thinking about the big picture. What they're thinking about is, sure, we want to keep truly crazy people from getting guns. And I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But
they're going to disguise. What they're doing is they're disguising the encroachment of governmental control under this common sense kind of thought, and that's exactly the way they'll put it. Hey, nobody wants a crazy person to have a gun.
Well, even the Las Vegas Sun, which is a paper here in Southern Nevada, if you're listening to this from some other jurisdiction, it's the liberal paper. They editorialized today that the National Institute of Health says 25% of Americans suffer from diagnosable mental disorders. They list depression, post-traumatic stress, and even anorexia. So, which subjects will the king allow to still have firearms? Because we're talking about 25% of the population. The National Institute of Health is the one that's providing the data, and they're saying it's 25% of America.
This is a really dangerous threshold that we're beginning to cross, and this is seriously a control issue for the government.
So statistically speaking, one of us is nuts, and one of us should be able to have a gun. So numbers-wise, which one of us?
yeah, specifically, you were going to point fingers.
I wouldn't use this panel as the example.
But my concern about this is, I've actually stood in court and said to a judge, Your Honor, we need this witness has issues, and we need to be able to address them to effectively adjudicate this case or defend the client or something along that lines. And I've had judges say, I'm sorry, I don't have the authority to order the release of those medical records. You need to get a HIPAA release signed by that individual. They won't give it to me, Your Honor. I need an order from the court. And we go back and forth on this all the time. I don't know if there's some escape clause. I'm sure the actual HIPAA law itself, is like 3.5 feet tall. It's like the tax code for 1/4 of the year. I don't know if there's some escape clause in there that gives the president the authority to administratively.
In order to know what was in it.
But I have a problem with the executive saying, you know what, Congress thought, the people who write the law thought it was so important that we protect these records that I'm going to simply say to states, I don't worry about that one. If you want to release those records, we're okay with that. That's a problem for me. And then randomly deciding that, well, outpatient, inpatient, how long you're in, involuntary versus voluntary. I'm kind of old-fashioned. If somebody's going to take away a core fundamental right, which the right to possess firearms has now been declared a core fundamental individual liberty in this country by the Supreme Court, I want a little more than my doctor, who's an anti-gun guy, calling up the state and saying, would you throw him into the NICS system?
But this whole executive order is symptomatic of what we've been seeing with this president, and this is, they haven't been able to get their agendas, their political
through
agendas,
Congress and legislative. So
right,
he's
through
taking
the legislature.
he's taking a backdoor approach to this, and with a lot of the gun laws, they've been doing the backdoor approach, and this is scary. This is very scary.
This is an entire bunch of people. The 25% is scary. They did. There were 2 studies in 2008. Before we had a lot of people back from the sandbox that were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. Before that, the Institute of Health reported in 2008 that in their view, 17 million Americans adults are diagnosed annually with depression. The Center for Disease Control, the other group that controls this executive order, in 2008 estimated that 21 million Americans are diagnosed with depression each year. That's right out of their data. So,
but are they taking this like depression is synonymous with being suicidal? Because that's,
it doesn't matter. It's a diagnosis that they can say.
If you're
sad
involuntarily
and
told to take
chemically imbalanced.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the legal line is going to be, where does it cut off if they actually get this through? It occurs to me, always has, every time they do this, that the administration has taken a beating essentially on every attempt at gun control. They lost almost every battle for gun control in the country. They've lost almost every one of their pushes. It went away for a long period of time.
But, Michael, everything they're doing in the last year has been, we agree, everybody has Second Amendment rights, but we've got to stop the crazy people from getting guns.
Right.
And that's
So
what
now
this
we're
is.
expanding the pool of crazy people to 40 million people a year.
You're absolutely, and that's what this is about. They went after what their primary goal was. We don't like those, EBRs. We don't like handguns. We don't like ammo. We don't like this. They lost all of those fights. Almost across the board, they lost those fights. So somebody in the planning committee over here said, let's go after something nobody can argue about, right? If it saves one child's life, that was a good line for them 10, 15 years ago. Now it's going to be, no one wants crazy people. Well, define crazy. Up until now, we've done a fairly good job of defining that. Now they want to throw in, well, little Johnny acts out, and so we're going to snatch him up because he's got the precursors to be a crazy guy. We're going to involuntarily commit him for a statutory period of time, and then we can narrow down the list of people who are allowed to have firearms.
My mind keeps on going back to Star Wars and the evil empire. And that's
They're going to
That
take
was
your
Reagan.
lightsaber, Randy. They're going to take it.
that's what I can't help but view that this government, the President of the United States and his familiar, Eric Holder.
Wait, you don't love him, do you?
This is part of an approach that they are trying to slide in and do get their political agenda on by a very, very savvy and just the way that Mike said it, they'll call people crazy and they'll yank their guns.
They snatch you up for the diagnosis, Tony, and say, well, this guy's been acting a little weird, so we'll have a psychiatrist look at him. He says, well, he needs help. And, depression is depression. Everybody gets post-traumatic stress a little bit from all kinds of things in life. We got all these folks in New York having post-traumatic stress from the one incident in the World Trade Center. Mm-hmm. We've got all this kind of stuff going on, which now, if you're not listening to what we're saying here, folks, this is probably the most dangerous thing I have ever seen in my career that spans some 40 years about taking guns away from people that have a right to have firearms to protect themselves. This has the potential of being an absolute disaster for the conservative movement in general in the United States. It ain't just gun owners that are going to be crazy, of course. It's them crazy right-wingers and them crazy Tea Party people. And watch the language coming out of the White House and Pelosi and so forth now when they talk about, this week and next week, when they talk about people being unbalanced mentally. Will they have to be crazy to think that? The words are getting thrown in there to make the reasoning fit what they want to do here. I think this is a absolute crushing point that needs to be handled.
Not to throw a wrench into the works, but the administration, there are some folks on the primarily the Democrat side of the aisle, and this administration has already admitted they would prefer a single-payer health care system over the current Affordable Care Act attempt to alter the way we get medical care. In most socialized countries that are single-payer, be realistic about that. Single-payer means socialized medicine. The government pays the doctor, and we pay our taxes. The doctors work for the government. In all of the countries where they have that, those records are direct to the government, and the doctors ask the questions the government tell them to ask. So they get this changed, then they get to single payer. I don't want to sound like a nut, but it's a possibility. It's been done before. That's the stepping stone to say, okay, now we have two pegs in place. We can take the guns away because now everybody who goes to the doctor gets asked 3 questions. Do you have any firearms in the house? Have you ever felt depressed? Do you drink more than 1 drink a week?
We've already seen this with veterans going through it on the VA programs. We've talked about that on the show. That they get told, are you feeling depressed, and this, that, and the other thing. And all the veterans groups have warned their guys about not going and answering those questions. and they're not getting treatment for PTSD because they're afraid they'll take their guns away, and they will. They do it at the VA now.
See, and the vets are in a single payer system. The VA is a single payer system.
And the government controls them. So I can see this being expanded to everybody walking around this country, that we're not going to be conservatives or constitutionalists. We're going to be nuts. And here it comes.
Well, that's the way you do it. You marginalize people by labeling them. You label them through statutory, or in this case, executive orders by the President of the United States, and suddenly the good guys become the bad guys. And this is more than frightening, especially, most of us on this panel have law enforcement experience. We understand the power that goes with being part of the government. And we also recognize the potential for abuse. And this is
It has an
huge potential for
unbelievable
abuse.
potential for abuse. It's
We've talked to cops,
Scary.
every cop that I've talked to, when we say, well, it comes down to it, and they tell you to go out and pick up guns from the general population, that these 7 people own guns, go get them. Most cops say, I will never do that. I will just tell them nobody was home. I will refuse the order, the oath keeper philosophy. And yet with this, if we tell cops, well, these 3 guys over here
They're
have
crazy.
been adjudicated nuts, in the opinion of their
getting guns.
psychiatrist, we need to get them off the street,
Right.
and they've got guns, the cops will go get them.
Of course they will, because now the government has given us this rationalization that gives us the go-ahead to do it.
Really scary. We've run way over on this episode, so this show is going to break a little funny. We've got one other little thing to go over when we get through with this, so we're going to have another short panel discussion, so we can leave this whole thing in the show, because I personally believe this is, as I've said over and over now, this is probably the most important issue we've addressed on this show, because this one is a big rock rolling down at us. And you got to vote. Sign up and vote in every election. It's the only way to fight them at the moment. We'll be back in just a few.
Today we're going to be talking about another kind of unique submachine gun called the KP-44. Hi, this is Tony with the Gun Store in Las Vegas. Today we're going to be talking about another kind of unique submachine gun called the KP-44. And this is a Finnish-made submachine gun from World War II. And it was made basically to compete with the Germans when they went, or the Russians when they went to the PPS-43. And it looks very similar to the PPS-43. However, it's a little bit different on the inside. This gun fires the 9mm round, and if you see the drum, like the Swami drums, the Finns made the drum first for the KP, the 41 model, and they adopted, the Russians stole the design for their PPSH-41, and then the Finns came out with the KP-44 for the same basic reason that the Russians went from the PPSH to the PP-43. It was very difficult to make. It was wood stock. It was used a lot of machine tools, and there was a great deal of waste in the machining process. So the Finns went the same route the Russians did. They made a very, very crude-looking PPS or KP-44. Now this one here, it was really weird that the Finns copied the Russians, then the Russians copied the Finns, and it's back and forth. This one also uses the drum, like their 41 model, and it also, or the 31 model, I'm sorry, the KP-31. It uses the same drum. However, they adopted this one also to use the more reliable stick magazines. And again, this is a double feed magazine. Folding stock. They made theirs in 9mm. Of course, the Russians made theirs in their 7.63 caliber. Slower rate of fire than the KP-31, much slower. The KP, the Finnish, the Suomi was almost 1,000 rounds a minute. and this one they slowed down to about 650. So it's a lot more controllable, you can see it's quite crude, but it was very effective for their needs also. So we're going to shoot this one. All right, we're going to shoot this one with the drum. We're going to insert it in, and we're going to do a couple short bursts, and then we're going to do a couple long ones and see how it works. You'll see that it's much controllable, and it's a lot slower rate of fire than the KP-31. As you can see from the target, extremely controllable gun, very, very nice. Shoots about 600, I'd say that was about 600 rounds a minute. Very pleasant to shoot, very accurate, and it served the purpose for what they needed.
Hi there, Mike Rogers from the Gun Store. Time for Moron of the Week. Let's see how not to do things.
Be safe, be conscientious, and you won't have to worry about ever winding up on the television show in our Moron of the Week segment. As a firearms owner, safe firearms handling is always your obligation. Every week on this show, we have a segment called Moron of the Week. These are videos we often find on the internet of people doing foolish things with firearms. Sometimes they do them intentionally, sometimes they do them accidentally. The 4 rules that you must always comply with are: treat every firearm as if it's loaded, never point a firearm at anything you don't want to destroy, never put your finger on the trigger until you're ready to shoot, and be sure of your target and what's beyond it. If you follow these 4 rules, you're probably going to be a long way towards never having a negligent or accidental discharge. There are other rules that you should comply with. Firearms are not toys. Don't clown around, and don't mix alcohol and firearms. Be safe, be conscientious, and you won't have to worry about ever winding up on the television show in our Moron of the Week segment.
Hi everybody, this is Mike Rogers from the Gun Store. Tonight we're going to talk about the genius Eugene Stoner's brainchild and everything that's evolved ever since he invented the original AR-10. That was done back in the 50s. Springfield was trying to compete for a big contract for the military rifle. Political decisions later made that the M14. But one of his designs, the AR-10, was the precursor to what I have in my hand. The rights to that gun were bought by Colt in 1959 from the Armalite Company. They made a couple of versions of this. The AR-15, which was named after the AR, was their semi-automatic version. The M16 and its precursors were the modern battle rifle as designed by Colt. This little gem here was used for a number of years in Vietnam. It evolved from a rather simple gun into a much better gun. Early on in its development, some of the things that were originally designed by Stoner were ignored. Things like a chrome-lined bore, a chrome-lined barrel, some of the other features on it, and certain problems started erupting in Vietnam and affected the reputation of the gun for reliability. Another thing that occurred was, for decisions, again political, the gunpowder was changed, and the combination of the fouling created by the non-spec gunpowder and the lack of chrome lining in the barrel of the chamber caused us to have some reliability issues. When it became the M16A1, a lot of changes were made and things were upgraded. The chamber was chromed, then eventually the entire barrel was chromed. A forward assist was put on. That was something that Stoner never designed, but was decided, somebody thought it was a good idea. And a couple other things were changed in the gun to make it more reliable. What's really interesting about this gun is it's been in service now with the U.S. military for more than 50 years. And the young GI from Vietnam in 1966 could pick up his counterpart, today's version that's being carried in Iraq, and he would be entirely comfortable with it. One of the reasons for the longevity of this system is the simplicity of the operating system. It's designed around a couple of different features. One of the things that's really important about this is it's a direct impingement gas system. This tube that runs over the top from the gas port here captures gases from the round when it's fired, and it pushes the bolt to the rear. It retreats into the stock against a buffer and spring like this. That spring drives it back forward, and when it does so, it picks up the next round from the magazine and places it in the chamber. The operator, to change magazines, simply drops the one he has, puts in a fresh one. He can charge the gun like so. The bolt releases right here, and it's ready to go. Another one of the things that's really popular with this system is the best guns are operated when you're on target, your safety is off. When you're off target, your safety goes back on. The ergonomics of this allow this more easily than just about any gun ever made. It's quite an amazing system, and it's basically unchanged since then. Some of the components have changed. There's a lot of stuff that adds variety. Ammunition has changed over the years. Back in the day, the old 193 ammunition was actually quite effective because it tumbled a lot in human tissue. A lot of people in NATO thought that was a bad thing. It was replaced by the M855. This has a penetrator core. There's a steel tip on it. That's back in the days when body armor started becoming popular. And we were afraid the Russians would wear some, so we got a steel penetrator. It was able to penetrate more. Nowadays, because of the longer engagement distances, especially in Afghanistan, the Black Hills Corporation has come up with a extremely accurate long range. It's called an open tip match bullet, and it's the Mark 262 bullet, and has extended the range considerably on this gun. One of the nice things about it, whether you were a GI in 1966 or a soldier in Iraq or Iran, when the gun needed work, it's very, very easy to disassemble. The disassembly tool, the gun was designed to take down to all the components necessary for a thorough cleaning by using nothing more for a tool than the bullet that came with it. You can pop the pins on it. Everything on here is extremely easy to replace in the tool. The lower end, the part that has the trigger mechanism, the selector, everything that makes the thing operate is in a kit like this, can easily be replaced. And these components here are for the upper end. You can assemble those, replace all your pins and springs in the field. It's very simple to do.
Hey, we are back here on Fired Up. The battle over gun owners' rights got a couple of victories in the last week or two, so we need to have some good news here once in a while. The state of Illinois and the city of Chicago are being forced by federal courts to defend themselves now against citizens who want to defend themselves and aren't allowed to have guns.
You know, two cases in recent history, 5 years in the Supreme Court, the Heller decision, the McDonald decision, changed the entire landscape on this issue. Heller said that the Second Amendment applies to individuals, but only in federal enclaves. The McDonald case, which comes from Chicago, said that it applies to the states through the 14th Amendment, and so states can no longer infringe on people's rights to possess firearms for self-defense. So that's where we're at.
Well, yeah, but in Chicago, there's no gun shops in Chicago. They've closed those a long time ago. And there's no place to buy a gun. There's no transfers allowed. There's no selling. There's no gifts. There's no way for an honest citizen in Chicago to buy and practice with a firearm.
So you're telling me all the guns that are used to kill people in Chicago aren't legal?
No.
Okay, just to clear that.
Gasp.
What
A federal district court judge, Edmund Chang, said Chicago's ordinance goes too far in outright banning legal buyers and legal dealers from engaging in lawful acquisitions and lawful sales of firearms.
So, the most anti-gun city in the United States is now being forced to allow their citizens to purchase weapons to defend themselves. And that's great news. But the city is appealing this decision, right?
Actually, they're not. They had originally said that they were looking at all legal avenues, which is almost always a precursor to an appeal. Mayor Rahm Emanuel came out and said He's going to ask the judge for a time frame. I think he asked for 6 months to craft laws to more effectively regulate the sale. Since they have to sell them, they want to effectively regulate the sale. And I think it's all going to be in the language of those laws is what's going to happen here. The look on your face is priceless, Emily.
Okay, so it has no effect. Like, what exactly? I mean, only another court case on locations or sellers of stores is going to have any effect on this.
Pretty much,
I mean,
they're gonna draft some kind of draconian law. You can only sell firearms when the moon is up at noon.
Mental health
on
records,
Tuesday.
maybe.
You have to have your
Blood tests.
5 signed affidavits from people in other countries. Something like that. They're going to create some kind of a law so they can prevent the things from being sold. That law will then come under legal attack.
Didn't that
we'll
same
start
thing
the whole
happen
thing
in
again.
Washington, D.C.? And weren't they?
It's exactly how they got to where we got with Heller. The city outright banned the possession of handguns and rifles for self-defense, and the court said that goes too far. Same thing happened here with this judge. Now the city's asking for permission to come up with a way to sell guns that's safe for the city, which is craziness.
You have the marijuana distributors in
No, that's
Colorado.
Colorado.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can have the evil government-run
So guns,
firearms
bullets,
distributors
marijuana,
in
but no
Chicago.
lighters.
Well, we got to point out, the judge said it violates the Second Amendment right of people to have guns for self-defense. But he is, despite that, he is an Obama appointee to the federal bench. So he immediately said that he's staying his order till it gets appealed or changed by the next court. So he said this is constitutionally correct. They can't keep people from buying and selling guns, but
But they can
it
regulate
doesn't-
it to make it impossible.
It doesn't go into effect yet until the next lawsuits go through. So this is another, if you're living in Chicago, another 4 or 5 years
Basically,
before you
what
can
he
buy a
said
gun.
is the state of the law is such. I have to say this, but I'm not going to actually do anything to make the city comply. It'll go to the 7th if somebody appeals what they do here, or if they start a lawsuit. Rahm Emanuel's argument is just crazy to me, though. He says, we wouldn't have such a problem if all of the areas around us had strict gun laws, because, of course, everywhere that's near a state with lax gun laws has the same crime problem as Chicago. Probably not, but that's his argument. And so that's how he's going to try and craft this to say, well, we just have to have tough
Never
gun
let the
laws.
facts get in the way of a good
Never
story.
let the facts get in the way of a good argument. That's right.
We are out of time, unfortunately, for what we have allotted for this segment. I appreciate you all tuning in. The radio show is on from 6 to 7 on KDON Radio, 720 AM. It goes all across the California, and it also is online. You can pick it up at kdwn.com if you want to tune in on Saturday evening, 6 to 7 Pacific time, where we are. We'd be delighted to talk to you and get your feedback on what's going on the show. Other than that, we will see you next week at the same time on the same station. Thanks for being our listeners. Audience.
Or something.